Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today with you all and to share a bit what the experience and perspectives of the ILO on ending child labor in domestic work. First of all, a bit of publicity to the ILO. Child labor in domestic work is a long-standing concern of this organization. We have, as we know, two conventions, the two fundamental conventions on the abolition of child labor. It's Convention 138 on minimum age for admission to employment and Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. These two conventions provide a very valuable framework for guiding action with a view to addressing and tackling child labor in domestic work. But aside from standards, the ILO and ILO IPEC in particular has been launching a range of research activities, technical assistance, advocacy activities that have indeed allowed to get a much better understanding of the realities and the patterns of child labor in domestic work across the world. And I would like to highlight the fact that the experiences and insights that have been gained through the work on child labor in domestic work have allowed to gain a better understanding of issues relevant to domestic workers more generally. And in fact, this experience has been crucial also for the shaping of the draft convention and of the draft instruments that have been, that were eventually adopted on domestic work. Let me spend a few words about Convention 189 and Recommendation 2.1 on decent work for domestic workers, because this is another device which is now adding to the other range of instruments that are at disposal of the international and national community to ending, that's me, sorry. Child labor in domestic work. As Joe had said earlier on, there are 10 countries that so far have ratified the convention. Half of these countries are from Latin America, so Latin America is somehow on the driving seat. And I think this is something that Latin Americans should be proud of. But I would like, and then there is one African countries and an Asian country, the Philippines. I would also like to highlight the fact that we are receiving ratifications from countries that are at the ending, at the destination and sending ends of migrant domestic workers. So we are having, for instance, Italy, my own country, and Germany that have ratified the convention, as well as many of the other countries from Latin America and other regions of the world that tend to send important numbers of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers. I think it's important to clarify a bit the basic concept, to get them right, because this will allow us to understand each other better and see what are we talking about. What do we mean by domestic work? What is meant by domestic work? According to Convention 189, domestic work is work which is performed in or for a household or households. And this was meant to capture the fact that in many countries you have instances in which one domestic worker may work for multiple households for a few hours per week. And at the same time, you have situations of domestic workers who work on a regular time, on a full-time basis, and live also in the house of the employer. So the idea was to capture the variety of domestic work situations across the world. And the definition of domestic worker is any person who is engaged in domestic work within an employment relation. And I think this is very important to bear in mind also when we think or talk about child labor in domestic work. We are talking of work which is performed in the house of other families, and the relationship between the worker and the family or households that employs them is a relationship of dependence and subordination. Then, child domestic work. What is child domestic work? Child domestic work refers to work which is performed by children in homes of other families, and it may comprise two types of child domestic work. Instances of child domestic work which are admissible, and instances of domestic work which are not admissible. When is child domestic work admissible? When it is carried out by children who are above the minimum wage age of admission to employment and below the age of 18. Inadmissible situations of child labor are those in which children below the minimum age of admission are working, or situations in which children are finding themselves in hazardous work or slavery-like work. So, when we are talking of child labor in domestic work, we are referring to domestic work which is performed by children who are below the legal working age, that are found in hazardous conditions or in a slavery-like situation. Joe referred earlier on to the global estimates on child domestic work that has been recently released by the ILO. There are across the world, these are very conservative estimates, I would like to highlight this, but according to them, there are about over 17 million children who work as domestic workers, and whether paid or unpaid, in the home of a third party or other families. An important thing is that the large majority of these domestic workers are girls. Actually, over 77% of children working as domestic workers are girls. And here there is a very interesting parallel with the percentage of women, adult women, who work as domestic workers. Indeed, according to recent estimates of the ILO on domestic work generally, 83% of domestic workers are women across the world. So it's quite interesting to see in the case of child domestic work, it's 67% who are girls. When we are moving to adult domestic work, the proportion of women increases, which somehow may suggest that indeed girls have much more limited opportunities also for professional diversification, and somehow the transition from child domestic work to adult domestic work is more commonplace for girls. Of the 17 million of children in domestic work, there are 11.5 million who find themselves in child labor. And of these 11 millions, you have 3.7 million that are working in hazardous work. The remaining 5.7 million are mostly adolescents, so they are working in admissible forms of child domestic work, but they constitute a group of children in need of special protection because they are particularly vulnerable to exploitation or abuse, because their dependency on the families for which they work is much higher than in the case of an adult domestic work. Sorry, but here we are, you know, as all here on this panel have played quite an important role in making Convention 189 a reality. So I hope you will allow me a few words to explaining why Convention 189 is so important and its relevance also to combating child labor in domestic work. First of all, this convention constitutes a shift in the prevalent paradigm. It actually recognizes domestic work as work. As it was said earlier on by Myrtle, very often domestic work is not regarded as such. And domestic workers are not regarded as workers. They are helpers, they are family members. This is a very patronizing way of referring to them, and very often they are regarded as second-class work. Another important feature of that convention is that homes are recognized as workplaces. And this is, you can imagine, this has tremendous implications, because this means that homes are subject to public policy. But this raises also a number of challenges in terms of how to ensure that actually labor protections are enforced when it comes to workers, and child workers in particular, working at home. Another very important issue is that this convention really says it very clearly and loud that domestic work is work which contributes in fundamental manners to the social and economic development of societies. It allows households to go on, and it allows other workers to work, to remain in paid work. So that's very important. It allows other work to take place. The convention is definitely a drive towards professionalization, and there is really a global momentum which is building towards better domestic work laws and policies. You know, 10 countries have ratified, other 10 have completed the process of national ratification, but in about 50 countries across the world, there are right now a number of initiatives of a legal, institutional, policy nature which are taking place with a view to making decent work a reality for domestic workers. Now, why am I insisting so much on the Convention 189? Because there is an extremely close connection between efforts aimed at ending child labor in domestic work and efforts aimed at improving the status, the living and working conditions of adult domestic workers. So we cannot really believe that there will be any sustainable results in the fight against child labor in domestic work if these are not accompanied and matched by significant efforts in terms of upgrading the status and recognition of domestic work more generally. And of course, the interlinkages go in the two ways. I mean, when we are looking at how perceptions and stereotypes relating to child domestic work and relating to adult domestic work reinforce each other. I mean, Myrtle was referring earlier on to the fact that in the case of children that are engaged in domestic work, they are not regarded as workers, but they are actually working in homes of others. They are doing work. They are cooking. They are lifting heavy loads. They are taking care of other children in the households. They are working. And the same applies to adult domestic workers. They are part of the family. They are helpers. And this explains also the high proportion of girls among child domestic workers, is that domestic work, child domestic work is regarded as work which is socially and culturally acceptable because it is taking place in the home, and therefore it is perceived as, you know, a very protected environment. You are with families. The same applies to adult domestic workers. There is a perception that, you know, work which is taking place in a home is not, it's a very cozy and safe environment. There are not occupational health and safety risks. There are no possibilities of being exposed to, you know, physical and verbal assaults, etc. And then in both cases, there is, for both child laborers and domestic workers, adult domestic workers, this idea that in reality what they do is work which anybody could do, which does not require any particular skills or knowledge. Girls and women are born knowing how to clean and to cook, etc. And I'm actually a living, you know, challenge of that myth. It's my husband who cooks at home. I'm incapable of cooking, so. And this idea that, you know, I'm doing her a favor by employing her, and again, in the case of child domestic worker, I'm helping this child work, because otherwise he or she would be condemned to poverty, starvation, etc. On the positive side, the fact of having a convention which actually says in a very unambiguous manner that they are workers and they should have rights and obligation on par with other workers more generally, allows precisely to determine what is right and what is wrong. It allows to identify a number of concrete risks that might be associated to that work. It also recognizes that it's work which requires skills and competencies that need to be upgraded. And it also makes reference to the importance of voice and organization of domestic workers themselves. When we are looking at the child labor in domestic work, this allows also to draw the line between child work, which is acceptable, which is not acceptable. It allows also for greater policy coherence, a better articulation between efforts aimed at ending child labor in domestic work and broader efforts aimed at improving the working conditions of adult domestic workers. I'm not going to talk about what the Convention 189 says, but I would just like to focus on what it says with regard to child labor in domestic work. So the first thing is that it sets a minimum age for domestic workers. So ratifying countries have to set a minimum age for domestic workers, and this is consistent with the two conventions on child labor. And that this age, minimum age for domestic workers, should not be below or lower than the age which is established for workers generally. So this is very important because it's addressing discrimination that might indeed arise vis-à-vis this category of workers. And then the convention is also looking very much at the importance of addressing the specific circumstances of that category of child domestic workers who are above the minimum age and below the age of 18. And there is a lot of emphasis on education. I mean, this is something that you both have alluded earlier on, the importance of education. And therefore, ratifying countries should indeed not deprive these child domestic workers of the possibility of completing compulsory education, because very often the young or adolescent domestic workers used to be child domestic workers before, right? And therefore deprived of the possibility of completing education, etc. And also the possibility of pursuing further education or vocational training in order either to enhance their skills as domestic workers or also broaden their possibilities of getting other opportunities. The recommendation which accompanies the convention deals with the issue of hazardous work. And it actually established that states should be identifying the types of domestic work that by their nature or the circumstances in which they are carried out may harm the health, the safety, and morals of children. Then it actually invites states to consider the possibility of looking at child domestic work as an hazardous occupation that might actually need to be eliminated. A very important thing is this idea of, this age bracket is a group of children who are usually neglected by many of public policies, right? When you are thinking of youth employment policies, it's for people between 18 and 25. So this is really a group of workers who are very often neglected, and for which there are a number also of ambiguities when it comes to what their, for instance, trade union rights are. The possibility, there are restrictions also on trade unions, for instance, to admit as members of trade unions kids that are below 18. With regard to the particular measure concerning young domestic workers, I would like to highlight the fact, for instance, of introducing limitations with regard to the hours of work in order to allow them to educate, to go to school, to remain in contact with their families. Isolation is one of the big problems that child domestic workers and adult domestic workers themselves face. Prohibiting night work, this is very important when we are talking of the intellectual and physical development of children, and the ability to recover the forces and strengths in order to be able to work the following day and to go to school. And placing also restrictions on work that is excessively demanding, and establishing or strengthening mechanisms to monitor their working and living conditions. My PowerPoint is much longer. And I would just like to end by saying that addressing or ending child labor and domestic work requires actions at different levels and engages many different actors and institutions, from government, from the social partners, from the broader civil societies. And I think that what has been achieved so far with regard to child labor in general is a reflection actually of these alliances and the need for partnership. Other essential elements, of course, are knowledge. In order, what you cannot count, you don't act upon. So the importance of data, you need to know what are we talking about, what the scale of the problem, what are the characteristics of the problem, because this will also allow to assess the effectiveness of policies. Advocacy, again, I think that one has really to challenge and change social attitudes on domestic work. Policy and legal reform, and again, I think the Convention 189 provide the sort of framework, and is actually a convention which is trying to and create the conditions for pushing domestic work from informality to formality. One of the reasons why child domestic work is so difficult to address is because it's invisible, it's taking place behind closed doors, in homes, and it escapes very often the statistics, and therefore it does not exist, it's not counted for. I will end here, and thank you very much for your attention.